Good afternoon, everyone. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to another enriching session of the ICS Wednesday seminar. My name is Muskan Punia, and I'm a research intern at the ICS. I have the honor of serving as the Master of Ceremony for today's event. I extend a heartfelt welcome to each and every one of you who has joined us. The title for today's seminar is Contested Geopolitics of Reincarnation, Tibet and China. Reincarnation, a sacred and fundamental part of Tibetan Buddhism and the Tibetan and Himalayan socio-political world, has become a political contestation between Tibet and China, going beyond Buddhism and religious scholarship. The principle and practice of reincarnation defy the modern principles of territoriality and sovereignty. Hence, it is crucial to analyze whether it is possible to reconcile traditional non-modern ideas like reincarnation with modern secularist ideas and practices of politics and international relations. The seminar will seek to analyze the modern incarnation system, both in China and in exile, and will also look at it within the broader context of China-Tibet, China-India, and China-West relations. The speaker for today's seminar is Professor Dibyesh Anand, who is the Interim Deputy Vice Chancellor for Global Management and Employability at the University of Westminster in London. A professor of international relations, he is the author of monographs titled Geopolitic Exotica, Tibet in Western Imagination, Tibet, a Victim of Geopolitics, and Hindu Nationalism in India and the Politics of Fear. He has published extensively on varied topics, including post-colonial politics and international relations, Tibet, China-India border dispute, Hindu nationalism, Islamophobia, and colonial practices of post-colonial states. He is the co-chair of Westminster's Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee and the chair of London Highest EDI Network. Today's chair for the session is Dr. Shering Chonzom Bhudia. She is advisor and in charge at National Institute of Educational Planning and Administration. She is also associate editor with the India Quarterly Journal. Prior to this, Dr. Shering was an associate fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies. She has also been a recipient of a ICSSR project and a China-India Scholar Leaders Initiative Fellow. She has also received other short-term fellowships in China, US, and Taiwan. Her areas of interests include negotiation theory and conflict resolution, the Tibet issue, and internationalization strategies of India, China, and select countries in the Asia-Pacific region. She has discussed these issues at various national and international forums. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all the participants to follow some housekeeping rules. All the participants will be muted during the presentation. Questions can be posted in the chat box during the event, or you can raise your hand during the interactive session, and after the presentation, you will be called upon to unmute yourself and ask questions. We request you to mention your name and affiliation while you raise your questions. That's all. I now hand over the floor to Dr. Shering to take the proceedings forward. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Muskan. Thank you, Snigdha. A warm welcome to everyone to the ICS Wednesday seminar. Hello, ma'am. Nice to see you. So it is my pleasure and honor to share this seminar being delivered by Professor Dibyesh Anand. I would like to thank the ICS and especially Professor Alka Acharya, Director, the Institute of Chinese Studies, for this opportunity. The topic for this seminar is Contested Geopolitics of Reincarnation, Tibet and China. And I have no doubt that Professor Dibyesh Anand, who has been following this issue for very long, would have some very important insights to share with us today. Without taking much time, I would just like to share a few basic points. I was just going through some of the important writings that are there on the issue of reincarnation and some of the authoritative books that are there on this topic. So I thought because Dibesh would be touching upon a lot of the geopolitical dimensions and contemporary debates, I thought I would just share some of the historical context to this discussion without taking much time. I think this historical aspect is important also to know that the contest between the Tibetans and the Chinese with regards to this issue of selection of reincarnate lamas predates the current People's Republic of China. So, because if you understand, if you're a history of the Tibetan studies or China studies, the Qing China and Republican China both had issued regulations with regards reincarnation of Tibetan lamas. So, the golden urn system of reincarnation, which forms the basis of current Chinese claims to its authority over the reincarnation of lamas, was instituted in the late 18th century by Emperor Qianlong as a part of the 29 reforms to the administration of Tibetan government, which was adopted in 1793. So Qing China continued to obsess with this selection of the lamas, which is also evident in the passing of the law of the Golden Urn as late as 1907. And Republic China went on in 1937 again to issue the law on the method of the reincarnation of lamas. So, but having said that, it is interesting to note, and while I was reading this in more detail, that current Chinese government, the People's Republic of China shied from the idea of issuing regulations or formalizing any procedure on the reincarnation for almost 4 decades. It was only in 1989, following the death of the ninth Panchen Lama, that the Republic of China felt compelled to revive this imperial golden urn system. So a quick review of the context in which the Qing, the Republicans, and currently the People's Republic of China's involvement in the entire reincarnation process reveals that all of them were driven by one common concern: the imminent threat to regime security, stability, either from an external actor or a combination of external and internal threats. So just to elaborate very briefly, for the Qing, it was a combination of both: the Gurkha invasion of the Tibet in 1791 and the perceived corruption, collusion, as you would like to call it, among the monks and aristocrats of the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism in Tibet and Mongolia in the selection of reincarnate lamas. For the Republicans, the imperative was more internal. Having a say in the reincarnation and co-opting of Tibetan reincarnate lamas was seen as a useful method of perpetuating its rule. For the People's Republic of China, the internationalization of the Tibet issue following the protests in Tibet in the late 1980s and the subsequent tussle with the Dalai Lama over the selection of the 10th Panchen Lama. Sorry, I mentioned 9th earlier. It's a 10th Panchen Lama, served as the backdrop for its foray into the reincarnation politics. So as a result, subsequently, China issued a number of regulations, and the first one being the 2007 regulation known as the Order Number 5. So it is quite clear that for all the Chinese rulers of Tibet, earlier and now, the main concern and the rationale for getting involved in the reincarnation process was to assert its role and authority over this issue. Basically, it was clear to all of them that the candidate that they choose would be their instrument to facilitate the sovereignty over Chinese rule over Tibet. Having said that, there are a number of exigencies that have emerged and achieved its own dynamism in the contemporary context. And given this background, I think it is very timely to engage in a discussion of the geopolitical dimension of the reincarnation issue, given the prospect also of dwelling Dalai Lamas in a post-current Dalai Lama scenario. And therefore, to unpack the perspectives and imperatives driving the approaches of the various stakeholders, including the Tibetans, the Chinese, as also external parties such as India, Mongolia, and others, as well as the resultant implications, I think there would be no other better person to discuss this than Dipesh, who has been dabbling with the issue of Tibet for a very long time now. I have personally also met Dipesh and have followed his work, and I'm very eager and keen to listen to his contribution to this discussion. And with that, I hand over the stage to Dipesh. Thank you.
Thank you sharing so much, and also for giving the factual context. That is important, because then I will not have to cover that. So I just wanted to thank you for sharing it, of course, Snigdha, Nuskan for introducing me, and Alka. So when sharing said, "Oh, good to see you, Professor." Well, most of you know Professor Alka Acharya, but maybe some of you don't. But I know, in fact, of all of it, I can see some familiar names. But possibly Alka, you'd be one of the first ones I engaged with when I started engaging back with Indian scholars on China, India, and Tibet, right? So you were there, and we hosted you here. more than a decade ago when we discussed China-India border dispute at Westminster University, and you were part of it. So again, good to see you. I wish it was in person. I'm more of an in-person person. But online also enables us to be more flexible, right, to engage with these issues. So on that, again, I have few ideas here. It's not a proper written paper, but it's more of an ideas I've collected. So I will speak for 25 to 30 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have a long discussion, question, answer, and we can go through that. Now, as you can imagine, specifically, I might be an expert on geopolitics. I might be an expert on Tibet, on China, but I am no expert on reincarnation. I don't think anyone is an expert on reincarnation in that sense, other than maybe reincarnate lamas themselves. But as we know that even reincarnate lamas, there's so much of contestation that one wonders that even the expertise is questioned. So let's start with that. Now, reason I was interested in reincarnation question was actually not to do with Dalai Lama, and we all discuss what happens post Dalai Lama. People have been discussing it. Many Tibetans are reluctant to discuss it for right reasons. But non-Tibetans like us, we would think what would happen in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years scenario. But we have to start with basic recognition that we are dealing with a sensitive issue. We are dealing with a sensitive issue because it involves sacrality, sacred. Now, of course, for those of us who might not share that sacrality, it's easier to talk than those who believe in that sacrality. And that's with any religion. So let's start with that. We are dealing with an issue that is not only contested, but it's also a matter of belief and faith and sensitivity. So as scholars, we can talk of post Dalai Lama situation, but you can imagine for many Tibetans, including in Tibet, including in occupied Tibet, it would be a matter of emotion, and it would be quite upsetting when we talk of post Dalai Lama scenario. In fact, my interest was not related to Dalai Lama itself. It was related to a contradiction I find in a modern nation state, in this case China, a modern nation state that's secular, that is actually ruled by a party that's officially atheist, that claims final authority over matter that is of faith, right? So the 2007, the order number 5 that Shering mentioned, is where Chinese Communist Party claims the absolute authority over who is a reincarnate Lama, who is a reincarnation. Right, so see, for me, in fact, it's not the Dalai Lama or not the Panche Lama, not the Tibetan issue that was the primary driving force to look into it, but about how a modern nation state ruled by an atheist party claims final authority over matters that are not, not secular, not modern, and not nation state related. That's a reincarnation. That's how I started looking at it. So what authority does Communist Party have to transform the manifestation of the Dalai Lama, post 14 Dalai Lama, to then say the Dalai Lama has to reincarnate in Tibet or under Chinese control? So we talk of Tibetan as a so that's what my background interest is. So we're dealing with the matter of tradition and modernity here, right? So China being a modern state and Tibetan reincarnation being a traditional practice and traditional belief. But what I would argue at the end is, now China claims to be the defender of tradition by saying that Dalai Lama cannot not reincarnate, and the reincarnation has to take according to the traditional urn system. So China, the modern nation state of China, becomes the defender of tradition, while the Dalai Lama from time to time says that he will decide whether he wants to reincarnate or not. You see, very peculiar situation where from reincarnation being seen as traditional and modern Chinese communist state being seen as the modern, we are dealing with a situation where the modern nation state claims to be the defender of tradition, and the reincarnate Lama, in this case, the Dalai Lama, claims to be more modern. So we are dealing with that. So I just wanted to highlight that part, right? Now, the tulku system, the reincarnation system, again, it is about belief ultimately. And this is with any religion, not only Tibetan Buddhism. It is ultimately about shared belief. If you believe in it, good. If you don't believe in it, it may not make sense to you. So we have to start with the assumption that we are talking of religious belief, we are talking of faith, we are talking of something that is about shared something. Now, again, those of you who are religious, I'm not. So for me, it doesn't make any sense. For me, any God doesn't make any sense. Any sacrality doesn't make any sense. But I respect that, of course, for certain Hindus, certain gods and goddesses make sense. For Muslims, certain prophet or Allah makes sense. For Christians, Buddhists, whatever, right? So I'm just saying is we are talking of shared belief. The tulku system, the reincarnate system, of course, is a peculiar mainly to Tibetan Buddhism, and those are connected to it, say in Mongolia, for instance, but broadly Tibetan Buddhism. So the note, of course, is that we are not talking of soul. Remember, we are not talking of soul. We are talking of manifestation. So manifestation of a high lama, and it's a reincarnate lama, transfers from one physical body to another after the demise of that physical body in most cases. Sometimes it can take place without the demise also. But it's a transfer of manifestation from one body to another because not the mission, but I'm being very layperson here, but the mission of that reincarnation is not fulfilled. So because the world is filled with injustice, you need compassion. So the Dalai Lama reincarnates because the world requires the compassion. So that's what the background to that is. So it is about shared credibility, shared trust. Now, is China politicizing it through this? Of course, it is politicizing. I mean, the fact that as it comes, order number 5, it says clearly that, and I'll tell you what order number 5, the details of that is, that they decide in the end is politicization. But nostalgia for an apolitical past does not exist. So some of you may know, some of you may not know. The term Dalai is a Mongol term. So from the very beginning, if you look at the Tibetan reincarnation system, politics was always there. So the fact that China is interfering politically is not novel. The Mongols were interfering, the Qing Empire interfered. So in that sense, as Shering pointed out the factual part, I would say that the per se political interference is not shockingly new. Right? So there were interference from the Mongols, from the Qing Empire in the past. But there was a difference. I'll tell you what the difference was. So as Shering said that it was largely about control, that for Republican China, for PRC, for Qing Empire, it was always about controlling Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism. I slightly differ here when it comes to Qianlong and Qing Empire. Reincarnation, I mean, when they came up with the golden urn system, mainly for Dalai Lama, Panchen Lama, and the one from Mongolia, right? Now, the purpose for Qing Empire was not to domesticate Tibetan Buddhism. The purpose for Qing Empire, actually Qing Emperor, was to strengthen Gelug sect and bring stability to it. I'll explain. So you had Qing Empire, Qings who were broadly followers of Tibetan Buddhism. For them, Tibetan lamas were teachers. Right? There was politics, but it was also a patron-priest relationship. Tibet was never very stable politically. You had different sects competing with each other, but even within Gelug sect, you had competition. So if you look at Golden Urn system, it was largely to bolster the authority of the Dalai Lama and Panchen Lama over broader Tibetan world. Some scholars have argued, very few, but I'll also make you think about it. Think. So the purpose was not to domesticate Tibetan Buddhism. The purpose was to make Gelug sect supreme over all other sects. Purpose was to bring stability to Tibet. Purpose was to actually strengthen the Dalai Lama and Panchen Lama and their authority. So ultimately, the purpose of Qing emperors' interference through golden urn system in reincarnation was to bring stability so that the Gelug, especially Dalai Lama and Panchen Lama's authority, would be absolute vis-a-vis over Tibet, right? So it was not Chinese versus Tibetan. It was not Qing Empire versus Tibetan. It was actually to strengthen Tibet and the Tibetan state. So that's what the purpose was. And why would the Qing Empire do it? They would do it, of course, because it was in the self-interest. It was because, of course, they shared the belief. So that was the purpose, right? So it changes with Republicans because Republicans are no longer they're not followers of Tibetan Buddhism. For them, it is about control over Tibet. But because Republicans did not have control over large parts of what Qing Empire controlled, it was more tricky. So with modern China, what I would say, when I say modern, I mean PRC, what changes drastically, and this is a big change, is it's no longer ruled by someone who's Tibetan Buddhist. It's no longer ruled by people who follow Tibetan Buddhism. It's no longer ruled by people who respect Tibetan Buddhism. So political interference now changes from strengthening Tibetan state to actually partnering with, weakening it, domesticating it and eradicating it. So in 1950, it was domestication, right? So Tibetan state is now, traditional Tibetan state has to be inferior to China. So traditional Tibetan state through 17-point agreement was one that would work within China, but would not have sovereignty. That's 1950s. After 1951, of course, the Tibetan state is eradicated. So please bear in mind, therefore, that when we are talking of PRC and it's engaged with the reincarnation with Tibet, there's something drastically new, which you cannot compare with even Republicans. And of course, you can't compare with the Manchus or the Qing Empire or even the other empires. Now, the purpose was complete eradication of sovereignty. It was to domesticate Tibetan Buddhism. It was not to use Tibetan Buddhism for any other purpose, which Mongols did or which Manchus did. So there is actually a difference. So where I would differ from some scholars who talk of continuity, I would say there's actually a break, a radical break. And that radical break comes from, of course, the nature of modern Chinese state, which is sovereign nation state, and of course, ruled by a party that's atheist party. Now, if Communist Party was not atheist, would it have a different policy? Slightly different, maybe. It would still have eradicated the Tibetan sovereignty because, of course, now we're dealing with the modern notion of sovereignty where you can't have shared sovereignty. You can't have any tolerance of ambiguity. So that's what we are dealing with, right? Now, where does it fit into international relations system? So that's one background. So there's a drastic change. Please bear in mind. So drastic change, of course, is that it's not a respect for Tibetan Buddhism. It's essentially domestication and then of Tibetan Buddhism and eradication of traditional Tibetan state. So eradication of state and domestication of Tibetan Buddhism. It becomes relevant when we come to the present times. Now, again, those of you who study international relations, we know we talk of sovereignty. We talk of nation state. We talk of boundary. India ends here, China begins here. India ends here, Tibet begins here. China ends here, Japan begins here, whatever. So there is no ambiguity. But when you take a concept of reincarnation, it goes against the principle of modern nation state. Because you can't have rigid boundaries, you can't have rigid borders, you can't have rigid sovereignty. So in that sense, traditional, or rather, the Tibetan concept of reincarnation does go against almost everything that modern internationalism stands for. That's second point for you to bear in mind, right? So first is, there's not continuity from Qing to today, there's a break. From managing Tibetan Buddhism to promote Geluk to now domesticating Tibetan Buddhism and eradicating traditional Tibetan. Second principle to bear in mind is that what China is doing is what modern nation states do. They assert sovereignty, absolute sovereignty without any compromise. Yeah, and we'll come to that. Third, but how have modern nation states in the region managed reincarnation? Because reincarnations are taking place. In fact, there's more reincarnation in Tibet today, occupied Tibet, than possibly in the past, right? So the living Buddhas in the system, that's how they do it. My argument would be that if you look at it, the three ways in which states are managing. By the way, the country that had one of the first laws to manage reincarnation in the region is not China. It is Bhutan. It starts a National Assembly debate in 1969 or 67, if I'm not mistaken. They had a resolution where they were very clear that if a Bhutanese boy is found as a reincarnation of a foreign lama, they meant Tibetan, by the way, right? Foreign lama, then they either stay in Bhutan in which they remain citizenship, or they leave Bhutan and lose citizenship. So it was started by Bhutan, not China. So again, something when we talk of China, Tibet, we have to remember that states in the region are not behaving drastically differently. They're all trying to manage, right? However, again, for Bhutan, the purpose was not to domesticate. The purpose was not to eradicate. It was to balance between their sovereignty, avoiding complications when it comes to reincarnation of Tibetan lamas in Bhutan, which can then lead to China-Bhutan complications. It was to manage. It was not to domesticate. So I would say Bhutan's approach was somewhat similar to Qing Empire and Republican China, which is in terms of managing but not domesticating, not destroying the institution. India's approach has been more agnostic so far, which is we're not interfering, but we deal with it somehow. And we know the Karmapa thing where India does interfere, by the way, but not officially at high level, but through institutions. Right? So, but officially, India takes an agnostic approach so far. Of course, so you have got an approach which is to still let let Buddhism and reincarnation continue, even flourish, but somehow manage so that it doesn't challenge the sovereignty in case of Bhutan. India's approach, it doesn't challenge the sovereignty, but we manage through agnostic approach. And of course, what China's approach is, not an agnostic one, not a management to let it flourish, but manage to either domesticate or even eradicate Tibetan Buddhism. I'll come to eradication part later, right? So there's a difference. So while I'm saying that 3 states are dealing with it, they have a different impetus to do it with it. Now, how does China do? As Shering pointed out, 2007 order number 5. What essentially it says is that any monastery that has reincarnate Lama and is looking for recognition has to get permission from via China Buddhist Association. Therefore, they have to deal with United Front Work Department. The United Front Work Department and China Buddhist Association. So China Buddhist Association is as a bridge. So the language used by Chinese government is that China Buddhist Association is a bridge between the monastery or the lineage and United Front Work Department, right? It's a bridge. What does bridge do? Bridge is two-way. If you have a bridge between Sri Lanka and India, then you can come from Sri Lanka to India, India to Sri Lanka, right? So bridge is meant to bring people together. So on paper, it sounds good. China Buddhist Association is a bridge. So China Buddhist is somehow neutral between United Front Work Department, which is Chinese Communist Party, and the monastery and the lineage. Sounds good in practice. However, China Buddhist Association is essentially created by United Front Work Department. So there is no bridge. It's only one way. So when you look at in detail, even the Chinese government policy order number 5 of State Administration for Religious Affairs, etc., it's very clear that it's not a two-way street. It's not a negotiation. It's not a balance. It's very clear, absolute 100% control by United Front Work Department. Now, what is the purpose of United Front Work Department? United Front Work Department is a part of a wing of Communist Party to help Communist Party engage with non-communists, right? So with minorities, with other religious people, with others. But anyone who studies the United Front Work Department knows that there is not even 1% two-way street. It's 100% absolute. It can never challenge Communist Party's views. Right? So again, bear in mind that we are talking therefore of a governance which is not actually a bridge. It is very much an absolute control. Chinese Buddhist Association, right? It's not there. So what, of course, Chinese Buddhist Association does is it nationalizes. When I say nationalizes, it's not Tibetan nationalism, as you can imagine. It's Chinese nationalization. It ensures a Chinese nationalization of process of reincarnation. So only lower, by the way, I shouldn't say lower lamas, it sounds bad, but tulkus who are not that significant politically, they'll get permission, it can be managed. Where the senior ones are, we say Karmapak, Dalai Lama, Panchen Lama, that's where the state. So again, it depends which Chinese Buddhist association you get. Do you get a local government's permission, or you get provincial government's permission, or you get Beijing's permission? For Beijing's permission is essential for the higher lamas, right? Now, so we are dealing with an absurd situation, I would say, where a party that is an atheist party that does not believe in any religion, not only Buddhism, no religion, claims the final authority over it, right? So we now have into a situation where various leaders, including Zhou Weichun, who used to be senior in the United Front Work Department, and I've met him in person in the past when he came to England, they were very clear, and they've said it clear again and again, that Dalai Lama has no authority. The 14th Dalai Lama has no authority to go against tradition. So Dalai Lama has to follow the tradition. So what is the tradition according to them? That reincarnation has to take place. Reincarnation has to take place in Tibet, and reincarnation has to take place with the golden urn system. 3 things. Now, as some of you would know, if you pay attention, so reincarnation, where imagine if I were a reincarnate Lama. Now, remember, all of us in Buddhism context, death, rebirth, there's a cycle, karmic cycle. All of us do that. But most of us are not enlightened enough to know what we were in the previous birth and what we will be in the next one, right? We are not reincarnate. Reincarnation is a very specific Tibetan Buddhist idea that there's some enlightened beings, right? So the adept lamas. So the notion is that if I have to say, imagine if I were a reincarnate lama, it's me who takes reincarnation. So the next reincarnation is exactly me. right? It's me. So I decide whether I take reincarnation in the West or East, where I take reincarnation in whatever form. I give indications. Who will decide after my physical body is dead? It will be those close to me, those who work very closely with me, right? So I will give indications, and the ones who will have search party and manage it in 5, 10, 15 years after my passing away, with this body's passing away, will be those who work closely with me, because they will know what my wishes are, right? So, for instance, if I go away and I'm just making it up here, Kate Saunders or Rityusha, who's there because I've seen their names, right? And if I'm not close to them, they can't claim authority. But if Alka and Shering, they have been part of my lineage, part of my labrang, part of my, they have worked closely with me, then they would know my wish. So they would be leading the search party, right? Very simple. That's tradition. So tradition is I give indications, and those who are very close to me will then choose, full stop. Now, Dalai Lama, given he has said very clearly, he will not take reincarnation in Tibet while it's occupied until unless there's a resolution with Beijing. He may not even reincarnate. Maybe he will. Maybe he will reincarnate as a woman. Maybe he'll reincarnate while he's still around, etc., etc. But he has been inconsistent. But he has also been consistent. Consistency is he will not reincarnate in Tibet until there's a political resolution. That's one. Now, China says, but he can't not reincarnate. So imagine that the one who's reincarnate said, I may not reincarnate, or I may not reincarnate, but I'll certainly not reincarnate XYZ place. But he has to reincarnate. That's one. Second, but how would Beijing manage the process, given that all those who are close to the Dalai Lama are in exile? So they will find people who are not close to the Dalai Lama, including possibly their candidate for the Panchen Lama, to go for search function. But the problem, of course, you can see, it goes against every single aspect of tradition. They're claiming to follow the golden urn system, but they're going against the golden urn system. The golden urn system was, even with all the contestation, essentially that basically those from the close to lamas would have a candidate, and finally the stamp would be done by the emperor. There is no emperor. Now, unless China has a Qing Empire renewal and there's a Manchu emperor who comes back, right, or empress who comes back, and the empress and emperor are Tibetan Buddhists, then maybe they'll have some kind of legitimacy. Otherwise, it makes absolute no sense. But we are dealing with a situation where China is doing it. You think, but why is China doing it? It would know that most people in the world, including Tibetans, will not see it as legitimate. Because ultimately, the purpose is not to have legitimacy over Dalai Lama. The purpose is to generate confusion, generate more chaos, make even Tibetans believe less in the reincarnate lamas. You might have 2 Dalai Lama, 3 Dalai Lama, does not make any difference to them. Because what they would want is, of course, Tibetan Buddhists to be less believers. Because they do have a problem with Tibetan Buddhism. So what I'm saying is, the purpose of China is actually not to have a Dalai Lama, next one, that people believe in, that they control. The purpose of Chinese government, is to actually generate confusion, generate more chaos, create a spectacle, and reduce the belief of Tibetans in the Dalai Lama as an institution. And once they do that, they can manage the process. Because once you have a system where a large number of Tibetans stop believing or reduce believing or are confused, the Chinese government can manage it better. That's what the purpose is. So I'm just saying that, therefore, it's not to actually have a Dalai Lama inside Tibet that they control, who everyone believes in. Take example of Panchen Lama, the Panchen Lama, that the candidate they have. This years ago, when I was in Tibet, when I was still allowed to go to Tibet, when I was in Tibet, the Panchen Lama issue was what most Tibetans I met were very clear. They kept quiet, but you could sense that they had no belief in him. The only way in which this Panchen Lama, by the way, the Chinese government, he can become legitimate at one point in time. All he has to do is praise the Dalai Lama and denounce Beijing, or not even denounce Beijing. If he actually praises the Dalai Lama, he might actually become popular. And this is what you'd find in Beijing, that the government knows that the main way in which any Tibetan High Lama gets legitimacy, the main way in which they can lose legitimacy is by denouncing the Dalai Lama. and main way in which can get legitimacy amongst Tibetan Buddhists by praising the Dalai Lama, right? So they have that dilemma. Now, I'll end in next couple of minutes is discuss. So you could see China contesting Tibetans. So what China's aims are is to generate disbelief. What's the significance for other parts of the world? Now, of course, vis-a-vis West and China, US is a government that has made it quite clear that this is an institution over which the Tibetans have a control. And it's basically the Dalai Lama and those close to him who should have a control. So US has broadly made it quite clear that it's not going to be respecting what Chinese government does. I'm hopeful that more governments will do the same. Now, that's not interfering in China's internal affairs, but that's making it very clear that they are following or they're respecting Tibetan authority. They are quite clear that they are about Tibetan belief. So they're not saying whether Beijing is right or not, but they're just simply saying Dalai Lama is ultimate authority. US has done it. Now, what has India done so far? From what I understand, you'd know better. So I'm more than happy to be re-educated by you. Re-education is the wrong word with the Chinese context, but you know what I mean. India's approach on Tibet, and some of you know, it won't come as a surprise. In my view, whenever I observe Chinese in Tibet, India's policy towards Tibet, maybe I can expand that during question answer. There is no policy. There's approach, there are approaches. Sometimes they contradict each other, but there is no consistent, coherent policy that is there. That at least as an outside observer, I observe. On reincarnation, it would not be interference in China's affairs for Indian government, given that it is the host for Tibetan community, including the Dalai Lama, to make the position quite clear that it respects the rights of Tibetans to practice their religion, and in this case, the right, therefore, of Dalai Lama to reincarnate and whatever according to his wishes. And I do think it would not be wrong for at least Indian Parliament to do something, if not the Indian government. And Indian Parliament is not Indian government. So if Indian Parliament passes a resolution saying that basically they respect the Dalai Lama, they thank Dalai Lama for contribution he has made to India, he has made immense contribution to India, and etc. And therefore they respect his wishes, etc., etc. That's not Indian government, but Indian Parliament could do it. Will it do it? We don't know, but that's something they could do. Because if they don't, if India remains agnostic, which is the approach so far, it will enter into more difficult situation, because you might have reincarnation taking place here and there, Chinese making controls here and there. So it is significant for India. For Mongolia, we know it is. Again, you never know where reincarnation of anyone can take place, because it's about belief system, right? And I know it's not a joke, but I do think, imagine, and I've said that maybe Alka would remember it, but most of the few would not. I mean, we were not there. Imagine that next Dalai Lama takes reincarnation in Tawang. Now, Dalai Lama has made it clear that he will not reincarnation occupy Tibet. It fits into that, right? Tawang is not controlled by China. That's why generally reincarnations take place in broadly cultural areas which are Tibetan Buddhist. So with Monpas, Tawang would fit into that bill. Now, according to Chinese maps, Tawang is China. So China would have to then say that actually reincarnation is taking place outside China, which it can't claim, given that according to Chinese map, Tawang is China. So that would pose a very, you can see for China and the border dispute and other things, a very interesting dilemma. But of course, you're not talking of interesting dilemma. I want to end by reminding ourselves that those of who study international relations, geopolitics, of course, it is about geopolitics. It is about life and death matter in terms of wars, borders, conflicts. It is about control. It is about sovereignty. But ultimately, what I would like to remind ourselves is that we are dealing with the belief system. We are dealing with the belief system, in this case of Tibetan Buddhism, which is under stress, which is under attack. And the Chinese government's key aim is, I said, not to eradicate Tibetan Buddhism, because they do like Tibetan Buddhism and it can be commercialized. They will tolerate Tibetan Buddhism so long as it doesn't threaten Chinese government's control politically. But what they will not want, of course, is a figure like the Dalai Lama, who's not under their control, to actually continue in the future without them being able to control. So that's what we're dealing with. So thank you so much. I know I was not very coherent in talking about it, but I do hope that you got some of the ideas. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Divyesh. I think that was a very refreshing take on this discussion. I think personally I really enjoyed, and you try to debunk some of the existing notions also with regards the issue. I think what I found very interesting was the fact that there is also some kind of connection between how the Tibetans also have been arguing about when you say that the contradiction in the Chinese approach being a modern nation state, a communist state, an atheist state, but also laying claim to something which is very deeply traditional, its authority over the reincarnation process. So this is also something that the Tibetans have also been saying, that how ironic it is for the Chinese to claim that they can search for the next Dalai Lama. So, but you also mentioned that your concern was not necessarily with, your talk was not necessarily going to deal with the issue of Dalai Lama or, his succession and things like that. I think what you also discussed in the initial period about this, how the PRC's approach has been a radical break from the past. I think that was also a very fresh take. And when you mentioned that how Qing and Mongolian China were more driven by the priest-patron relationship, and they did not really intend to destabilize the Tibetan the kingdom per se. So in the context of the People's Republic of China, you mentioned that the imperative is very more absolute in terms of domesticating and in terms of establishing absolute authority over the Tibetan entity, and also to undermine Tibetan Buddhism completely. And you went on to also say that the whole idea about these issuing of these regulations, I mean, if I understood you correctly, you mentioned that is not to just control the reincarnation process, or to have the next Dalai Lama inside China, but more to undermine this whole process, to create confusion and chaos. And so these were going to be the I mean, the byproducts of going to serve the Chinese interest in the larger sense. So I thought that was one different take I hadn't heard about. And then you went to discuss about India's policy, and I mean, this is something that you've also been discussing in the past, about how the policies been consistent, but lacks teeth, in a sense that, and today you mentioned that it's an agnostic approach, in the sense of it's neither here nor there. It's so that there is a scope for the Indian Parliament to do something. And you also delved into how, if in the future scenario, if the Dalai Lama is born, say in Tawang, and how that would complicate the border issue between the two sides. So I think with that, I will open the floor for discussions. And there are a few questions which are already there in the chat box, which were typed in quite early. So I could start, if you're okay with it, I can start with the first one. And then if somebody, will we be taking
I can read.
questions? You can read it?
Look, I know. I can see the
There is a
questions.
question
I mean,
from Rityusha.
yeah.
In your opinion,
So,
how can the Dalai Lama?
I know. So I can see there's a question written in hand. Rityusha, do you want to read your question, or should I just answer your question? Her hand
Hi.
is
So
raised.
hi, thanks a lot. So I also have a follow-up question. That's why I raised my hand. But
I'll do it
if
together.
there are more
Please
questions, I
ask
can
and
also
I'll do it together.
later. So
Okay.
yeah, I mean,
So yeah,
the
I
first
think it's
question.
fine for people to just raise the questions. I think if you've typed in also, yeah, you can turn
Yeah.
on your video and just speak as well.
Okay, I'm trying to turn on my video. Okay.
Mm.
All right. Yeah. So, of course, the first question is how the Dalai Lama or CTA or Tibetan Buddhist community can navigate and respond to the challenges. As we have seen what Chinese government is doing in terms of trying to control the reincarnation process, but also the fact, like, how do you see the Dalai Lama's current Dalai Lama's endorsement of the Mongolian reincarnation of Khalkha Jetsun Dhampa Rinpoche? Do you see it as an attempt by the Dalai Lama to seek a reciprocal approval for his next reincarnation within larger Tibetan community, especially considering that China has placed its own Pancham Lama within Tibet? So how do you see that? And of course, I mean, I'm not really going to get into that. If India does take a step, what could be the next step or future steps by China in that sense? But If we focus on just the fact that China is preparing for a post-Dalai Lama or post-Dalai era, by having its own Dalai Lama, what are the options exactly available to the current Dalai Lama to counter that same? So I think I really want to get your take on what are the options and strategies available to the Dalai Lama right now. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll answer all this together. So thank you so much for a very important question. We can have long discussion on this. What we find is Dalai Lama is quite consistent in that sense. So what he did with the Mongolian case recently is what he's been doing. So even with when it comes to Kalmyk Republic, Kalmyk Buddhists, the Dalai Lama has been quite consistent in being an authority. And it's not that he's authority, but people see him as authority. So we'd find with Dalai Lama, even when he doesn't want to take stance, people respect what he chooses, right? So even the Karmapa is an example, by the way. So in a way, Dalai Lama has been consistent in keeping broadly Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, including Mongolia, the parts flourishing and being seen as the authority for who the reincarnation can be. So he has been consistent in that. And when we look at what he has done, his office has done, and what central government, Tibetan government in exile have done, they have been broadly, again, consistent. They've been saying again and again that this is a process that the Dalai Lama decides, this is a process that his Labrang will decide, this is a process that Tibetans will decide. So in a way, reincarnation and the response to that from Tibetans is ultimately an assertion of sovereignty. If you take example of sovereignty, what China claims, Tibetans are claiming sovereignty over the process. But they know that, of course, that sovereignty isn't a direct erasure vis-a-vis China. So that's what they've been doing. The options they have, I would, of course, is to say, keep doing it, what they're doing. But, and again, I don't put it back on Tibetans, because ultimately it's our responsibility as non-Tibetans, because Tibetans are in exile. They're facing colonization in homeland, and they're facing refugee status in large parts of the world. So they would not have as much option as, let's say, other scholars like us would do. I would say, but Tibetans have to work with governments outside China, again, to get messages clear, at least policy statements out, if not from government, from parliaments, if not parliament, at least intellectuals, if not intellectuals, then at least some people who would be supporting them, to make it quite clear that ultimately we are dealing with a process that is about belief, and therefore the Chinese Communist Party's interference in that would be seen as a contradiction. So something along those lines. So they should continue what they are doing. But as I said, India is a crucial actor. And again, I'm not putting it back on Tibetans, because ultimately responsibility is on you, us, right? With India, that we do. I don't know what India can do, what implications can be there, but almost complete silence on part of majority of Indian members of parliament. Forget government. I understand the government will have to be tread more carefully. Is not a healthy way in which India could respond, because in a way, India is constraining its own options by not doing anything about it proactively, given that it will have an implication for India. So what I would say, I know it's a long answer to say that Tibetan government is already doing what they can do. They should talk about it, but exercise control over it. Not talking doesn't help. And yeah, that's it. So. Sharing, should I go to the next question from Tenzin?
Yeah, there is a long question, Dibyesh. The crux
I can
is how, just go to the last part. How do we form discussions with them to bring the real discourse at the force, so that peoples from all walks of life are not debating with false facts?
Yeah. So again, the only thing I would say to that is, look, ultimately, and I shouldn't say I go back to the Dalai Lama on this, is I recall Dalai Lama coming to our university. I was hosting him, talking to him, and I wanted him to talk about Tibet and other things, and democracy, and whatever. And he kept talking about things, including the importance of working with Chinese people in this case, right? And he was quite consistent, and in private and in public, that ultimately with various things, it is about dialogue, it is negotiation. Now, again, I've said in different contexts, when we, sharing, I talked of contradiction, you recognize I was saying the contradiction in Chinese government's approach. The sad reality, or the reality, of course, is it's not Chinese versus Tibetan. It's a government which is now adopting even more hardline approach vis-a-vis, in this case, Tibetans. But Chinese government, the CCP has done something similar with Chinese people themselves, Han Chinese people also. So the idea of domesticating religion, controlling it, commercializing it, or tolerating some aspects so long as it isn't challenged is across the board. It's not only with Tibetans. We have seen that with the Uyghurs. We have seen that with, Falun Gong sect, right? Falun Gong was a practice in 1990s that was quite common amongst even Communist Party officials, their parents, their family members. And then it becomes a sect that was seen as an enemy. So we are dealing with a government that is, therefore, I would say, is okay. So the question and answer to that would be dialogue is important. It is about sharing of facts. But you could see I differed from those who said that, oh, Chinese, no, that the facts have been consistent. Dalai Lama's institution became strong partly because of Qing Empire, partly because of Mongols. So in that sense, Tibetan Buddhism flourishing was never only about Tibetans. It was often about Tibetan Buddhism's attraction or attractiveness to those around it. So maybe that gives us hope, right? So as in, how do you negotiate? I don't know. How do you have dialogue? We don't know. But not reducing it to Chinese versus Tibetans might be a way out. Does that help answer the question to an extent?
Yeah, I think just an addition to that, I think I mean, I could be getting it wrong here. I think what you're also pointing out is the fact about the instrumentalism of, of this whole idea of being a traditional thing, a non-modern, the idea of reincarnation, the system of reincarnation has served instrumental purpose throughout history for all actors involved, whether it's the Tibetans, Mongolians, and Qing China, because one is serving the other's interest in terms of reinforcing one's rule and authority. The Tibetans served the Qing in terms of perpetuating their authority, and then that they helped the Tibetan lamas to maintain their religious authority. So it was like for both sides it was a convenient instrumentalist kind of a thing. And from the Chinese perspective, if you don't go into this more fate accompli kind of a, what you've said, I totally that is one perspective looking at it, that this approach is more driven towards accomplishing something which is a creation of chaos. And so here there is also an instrumentalism again. So they don't really believe in Buddhism, you say, and at the same time they are interested in using it for their own purposes. And from how I see, from how I would like you to deconstruct this for us is this perspective from the Chinese approach, is it really given? How clear is it, this approach? How predetermined is it? How final is it? Like when you say in your abstract, it's irreconcilable. Is this something that we need to take it at face value? Is there some inconsistency within the Chinese, is this something that is only endemic to the current China under Xi Jinping? Or when I was just looking at previous work, when I referred to in my introduction also, about how until the 1980s, until Panchen Lama's demise, Chinese were not really interested in religion in that sense of controlling the reincarnation process. It was not really a problem for them. It only they really got into the fray only after it became an issue when Dalai Lama recognized the 10th Panchen Lama, and that's how they got involved in it. So how would you look at it? Is there any scope for looking at it in a more open-ended sort of a way? Some
It is
way
okay.
of
Natha, you raised a very important point. That of course, when we say since PRC's formation, even I said in 1950s, it was accommodation, so long as sovereignty was areas of Tibetan state, and then after 60s, eradication of Tibetan state, but not Tibetan Buddhism. So where the opening lies, when Mao was asked about in 1959, when Dalai Lama was fleeing, right, coming to exile, and Mao was asked, warned by the Russians. The Russians did warn. So, and remember, Soviet China, USSR, China were having some tensions. But when Khrushchev, Khrushchev was there, warned Mao about the Dalai Lama fleeing and the problem it might pose for China, Mao's response was that he didn't care. There might be 6 Dalai Lamas. Ultimately, Tibetan people will trust and come to see Communist Party as the liberator. So he didn't believe in it. That's one. Now, if you take example of Communist Party of China, today's party is barely Maoist when it comes to economic policies, right? It's a hyper-capitalist party. but it is Maoist in terms of organization and in terms of control over political dissent. So if imagine Mao came to, I'm thinking, if imagine Mao just somehow woke up and came to Beijing, possibly he'll be eradicated because he would be seen as an enemy by Communist Party of China, not that policy. So what I mean is, even Communist Party has evolved, has changed. Evolution is not in one direction. So when you say, of course, it can be reconciliation. If under Communist Party, under Xi Jinping, they could have more easily adopted and more accommodative policy. I can you what policy, right? So one thing is, they say we are the final authority on reincarnation, but they don't need to find someone reincarnation. So let's say a scenario where a senior lama is no longer around in exile. There's a recognition in exile, but Beijing does not recognize anyone and says, we will recognize your incarnation exile, but in return, you need to come back to Tibet and let's have a political negotiation and we resolve. Imagine a scenario, a more open government. But the problem, of course, is so it is very much possible. So Beijing withholds any recognition, uses that as a leverage with exile to come up to a political solution. Now, the problem, of course, is if Beijing does recognize a Dalai Lama internal, that's the end of political negotiation, because you would never have a resolution ever in history if you have a Beijing appointed Dalai Lama and an exiled Dalai Lama, right? But Beijing has an option of not recognizing anyone and using recognition as a stop to get it. So what I'm saying is, there are openings, there are possibilities. And I am someone who doesn't ever stereotype, not even Chinese Communist Party, forget Chinese people. There would be, I'm sure, voices of moderation. There would be voices of accommodation. There would be voices who are saying that, why are we creating bigger problems rather than reducing the problems? Which connects to Upper Lama's question, by the way, which is about Panchen Lama, the China-appointed Panchen Lama, reincarnation. Of course, he's getting platform. Beijing will invest, I'm sure, billions of dollars for him to get recognition. The problem they face, of course, is that there's always a question mark after his legitimacy, which did not exist with the Karmapa. I'm thinking that even the Karmapa that Beijing recognized and Dalai Lama recognized, because of course all of them had recognized. So there's an inherent illegitimacy there. That's the problem they face. Imagine if this Panchen Lama was sent out to the world, you'll have protests throughout. Not will protest, they'll always be questioning. So the purpose of Beijing to have a Panchen Lama candidate that somehow can domesticate Tibetans will not be fulfilled. So I think that's the challenge that they face, right? Should I answer other questions, Shering? Right? Okay. So Kate, and I'll come to Imranullah later. But Kate, your question, thank you again with the Karmapa thing. Now, see, so we had the Karmapa imbroglio, I would say, the three Karmapa, if I'm not mistaken, isn't it? But anyway, there was one Karmapa broadly in India in exile. There was another Karmapa growing up in Tibet. Then the one in Tibet who was broadly recognized by both Dalai Lama and Beijing. He comes to exile, and there's always a question mark in parts of Indian establishment against that Karmapa. But we have been through that. One thing I would say to it, and I remember saying this to an Indian, let's say, intel officer. If some of you are intel officer, no offense to you, by the way, but I've said that in the past also, that India's approach towards Karmapa was the most unintelligent one. If you get a boy who's 14-year-old, somehow you have a question mark about him, and in 13 years or 14, or more than that, I think 20 years in exile, you haven't managed to change, then there's a serious problem with your agency rather than anything else, right? But it's not a joke, it's a serious matter. The serious matter is that you found that the two Karmapas have reconciled, more or less, right? So here's an opportunity for India, actually, to stop putting question mark, give platform to the main Karmapa, the key Karmapa, the one who's seen as Karmapa by most, because even the other Karmapa, they recognize that the wicked guy, and allow him some space to teach and preach. I'm not saying allow him space to do any, but just allow him space to preach and teach, because that space was reduced by, and I would blame Indian government for that. What it did from 2011 or 2013, I remember, I was quite actively involved, so, almost a decade ago. Do not disrespect. So parts of Indian government, it's not Indian government again, but parts of Indian establishment adopted not an agnostic approach, but a very hostile approach towards that Karmapa. And that was not helpful for India ultimately. So I would say that's what it should. He should be allowed to travel. He should be allowed to preach, teach, etc. That would have been better. Imranullah, thank you for your question. Two things. International community is divided, as you can imagine, in any part of the world. So some Western governments have been quite positive in recognizing Tibetan struggles, supporting them not politically, but at least culturally, allowing them to flourish, and questioning China. Many non-Western governments have not done the same. Right? So that's we have to. So there is no international community response. It's quite divided. The significance, of course, in governance that without reincarnation in Tibetan Buddhism, without reincarnation, Tibetan Buddhism would be drastically different. For those who are not Buddhist, remember, Dalai Lama is not a prophet. He's not son of God. So he's not Jesus Christ in Christianity. He's not a prophet. He is the sacred himself. So in one sense, the Dalai Lama's institution is more sacred, even, I shouldn't say more sacred because you might, but more sacred than even son of a God or prophet of God. He is the sacred. So that's something we are talking about. Kate, Tarun Upadhyay, it doesn't have policy, there's posture. What should India's approach be, especially now? Look, first, let's have a discussion, honest discussion in India, amongst scholars, amongst activists, with government policymakers coming, listening, and not preaching. ICS has played a very crucial role in having, I would say, I shouldn't balance, but having different viewpoints. I know because I've also spoken at ICS, you have got different viewpoints. But we know that in India, I mean, I don't know, maybe it's changing in India, but I remember in the past when I would be slightly critical of India's approach towards Tibet, I was seen as it was not taken lightly. So my problem with Indian government's approaches or Indian bureaucratic approaches, not all, of course, they have good bureaucrats, they're good open thinkers, that parts of bureaucracy are quite, what's a polite word? Find a polite word for me. A part of the bureaucracy, because you're more polite than I am. Okay, the parts of bureaucracy are more, let's say, less open to any criticism. So if you say that, India doesn't have a policy, it has an approach, rather than saying, okay, you know what, you're right in this way, you're wrong in this way, which is a good, healthy debate. There was you do not know anything, you're a foreigner. You do not know anything. I said, okay, tell me what don't I know? And there's never an answer. So what I would say is what India needs is an honest, frank discussion, conversation across the board in think tanks, in government circles, in media about not how India is great or how India is not great, but look at what is our approach towards Tibet. Does it work for India? Does it not work for India? Let's have, discussion, debate, and then come up with an approach. That might be better rather than saying, oh, we are great or we are not great, which is often the approach in India. So now, Dalai Lama not unequal condemning. Look, Dalai Lama can, only thing I would say to you, Tarun, is Dalai Lama is the biggest asset you have in India. There is no better soft power resource for India. If you think the Prime Minister of India is an asset for half the population, but half the population is not. You know it, right? So he might be loved by half the people, by half the people is not. But internationally, the only person in India who's deeply respected in large parts of the world, and he keeps talking good things about India, is the Dalai Lama. So Dalai Lama is very much there. Now, him unequal, he can condemn China's action, doesn't make any difference, frankly. And if I may ask, and I have written about it with a colleague of mine, Natasha Shokal, we wrote about Galwan Valley and India's response. Do you really think you can have in India a frank discussion of what is happening in Galwan Valley? Where has India gained and where has India lost? Given that the government has adopted a position that somehow India has gained a lot, we have adopted, I hope, well, don't get offended, but I'll say it to you. Last year, a year ago, I was in Delhi. I needed what's called endoscopy. I had some problems, right? I was in a hospital for endoscopy. And the surgeon, who's a very high-profile surgeon, by the way, he said, oh, you're a professor of international relations. I believe you work on China-Tibetan. I said, yes. He said, aren't we doing great now, finally? I said, what do you mean? And this is before the pipe was being put in my mouth. He said, finally, our government is showing to China I said, but the reality is that we are also losing parts of territories in that region. He said, no, but we are finally standing up to China. So I knew what his views are. Now I am going to be having endoscopy. I can't challenge him. But he was, and I said, but you do know that there are territories where India has lost. He said, no, I think we've gained, and finally India is standing up. So the problem in Indian context, of course, sadly, and ever sadly, is that because of politics, you can't often have frank discussion of where we have gained. Sorry, not I'm not where you have gained and where you have lost. So for me, it's not about Dalai Lama and you condemning China's action or not. He can condemn; it will make no difference. The fact is, what we need in Indian context, even in border dispute, is an honest conversation of what is working and what is not working. And what is not working, I would say, is in any democracy, that what is not working is not having frank conversation of where government policy is good, where government policy is helping, and where government policy is wrong. But there's a media perception somehow being created that the government policy is 100% right. That is what is happening in India, and I don't think that's a very healthy thing, by the way. Have I answered? I think. Thank you, Wade.
One question by Tenzing Damdul regarding the dialogue between the Tibetans and the Chinese.
I think his answer is the way ahead. He says that dialogue is the way ahead. Dialogue, but how would you have dialogue if the Chinese government doesn't want dialogue? Tibetans have been saying they want conversation, they want dialogue, they want talks. But since the Olympic time after that, Chinese government doesn't want dialogue. And that's the arrogance of the system, by the way. But by the way, going back to Tarun's question, I do want also that, look, India is in a... Tarun, you have a hand raised. Yeah, please. Yeah, ask. Go ahead, Tarun. You have your hand raised.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can.
So, Debashish, I mean, you have rightly said that we need to have more honest conversation with regard to the Tibet. But I just want to zoom in at a very particular point here. Now, you know what is happening along the borders, and you're rightly saying so. We have China has annexed the territory, and I talked to quite a lot of Ladakhis, and that's a fact. The government of India admits a lot, but what is happening on the ground is known to everyone. So now this annexation by China, I would use the term annexation, whether someone likes it or not, but this annexation by the China also comes in the backdrop of a reincarnation issue. And couple it with that US is hedging India to counter China. So can India play out this role if not to corner, but at least to give a pushback to China on this issue? And secondly, I just want to know one thing from you. If the person who is to be reincarnated as a Dalai Lama is let's use the term appointed by China, will he be recognized across the Buddhist community? That's two things I want.
Yeah. No, second, with any faith group, it's always filled with contradictions and confusions, etc. So will a Chinese government appointed Dalai Lama have legitimacy amongst wider Buddhist world? Doesn't matter, because broadly, even if you look at Buddhist world today, large parts, they respect Dalai Lama, but they don't have much dealing with him. My sense is, and of course, it's a hypothesis, we don't, that they would not have any legitimacy amongst most Tibetans, inside and outside. Because, and I'll tell you what, if Chinese government was that confident that they control the process, they would have allowed this Dalai Lama's picture inside, right? The photos are banned, everything is banned. The fact that Chinese government is so insecure about the 14th Dalai Lama tells you that they recognize that he has legitimacy, he is deeply respected, and he is deeply popular. And therefore, whatever Chinese government does internally would not have legitimacy amongst Tibetans. Wider population, who knows, in 20, 30 years' time, they might want to buy here and there, but broadly, they would always be a huge mark of legitimacy. I don't think, therefore, that's there. Now, US, as you pointed out, my concern vis-a-vis any, let's say, any country that works too closely with the US. Two examples I'll give to you. Pakistan. Pakistan was an ally of US in Afghanistan war in 1980s, and you saw how US dropped Pakistan when it no longer required it, right? Number two, Kurdish struggle, and I'm a strong supporter of Kurdish movement here and there in different parts of the world. The Kurds were supported by US, and once ISIS was defeated, broadly speaking, then US dropped Kurds and let Turkey crush parts of it. So what we have to be careful with the US and hedging the bet is that ultimately US looks after its own interests, isn't it? Now, is India in a position where it can use US help where it suits its interests, but also push back against US where it wants to? So being an ally of US, I don't think works for most countries in the world, most countries. Second, India is in a strong position. India, it's a emerging power, medium-sized power. India has a strong non-alignment policy. I still believe non-alignment allows opportunity where you can engage with the US, work with the US, but also work with China when it suits you. What India should do, if you ask me on the border, of course, is right now, is in this case, it is, reincarnation is a backdrop, but also the backdrop is the Kashmir thing. We saw what China's, I mean, a lot of scholars have said that, commented that China became more proactive in that region once it felt that India could be adventurous vis-a-vis Pakistan controlled Kashmir, right? Pakistan occupied Kashmir. So it's much more complicated. But what India definitely needs is not to, at least within its, you said that you've spoken to people, most people know that there are parts of territory that have been annexed by China. But large parts of media, if you look at that, and I've been speaking to even media senior people, they know it, but they say we can't say anything on it because we can't criticize the government, because if we criticize the government will be seen as weak. So we have to talk about it. So what I would say is what's required on the border is have not, but have honest discussion, strengthen Tibetan community. If you ask me for one single policy recommendation, Tarun, for Indian government, is to strengthen Tibetan community in India, give them as much freedom as possible within law, without them adopting violence. Anyway, they don't adopt violence. Strengthen Tibetan community, because medium term and long term, the best buffer India has vis-a-vis China is a strong Tibetan community in exile. That would be my recommendation. Alka's hand, I think another hand. Thank you, Tarun. Anyway.
Yeah, so shall I come in now? My wireless is showing, very wavering things, so I'm not going to put on the camera. So thanks, Divesh, as usual. You never fail to disappoint, I must say. It was extremely electric in many ways. But I'm looking more at this issue of the Tibetan community as such, inside and outside. And now increasingly you have a large Tibetan diaspora, which is coming under the sway of, let's say, modernizing influences. They're not as connected to their roots. And I'm not making this as a general sweeping statement, but the fact is that diasporas everywhere do show different kind of aspects in the way in which they integrate and in the way they integrate with the home country and connect with their original sort of place of origins. How do you think is this question of reincarnation really resonating across the Tibetan communities outside? Because somewhere it would be what you're saying about the Chinese policy would make absolutely, I mean, it would be very easy for them to do what the stages you're saying, and they have a hostage community which is obviously not having much political support across the world. But what about this external? I mean, is the PRC government at all interested in bringing them into their kind of fold, or are they just not concerned with this emigre community? They can stay outside. They're not going to make trouble for us. Let's focus on ensuring our goals vis-a-vis the Tibetans here, because it's a big deal. So how do you see them actually thinking about this large issue outside, or is it only a matter of internal?
No, thank you, Alka. Again, very important point. In fact, I don't think it's in India, but here in the UK, I know because the embassy is not far from our university, right? Embassy has an official. So imagine an official in UK embassy. So it would be one of the important embassies for China. The embassy has an official whose sole job is to look after, surveil, whatever, however you want. Basically, they're concerned with Tibetan affairs. So affairs of Tibetans in exile. Now, there are between 300 to 1,000 Tibetans in the UK, so that's not many, but you have got an official whose main job, of course, is to keep a watch on Tibetans, but they will say that they engage with Tibetan, overseas Tibetans, is the term they use, but also engage with people, not engage, but look at what is happening on Tibet here. So they give that much importance. And I'm sure if it's in the London, it would be in Washington. So they do pay attention to what's happening in exile. That's number one. Number two, wherever you have got the fact that Dalai Lama doesn't travel overseas anymore, but whenever you have got any Tibet-related event, you can expect objection from the embassy. So that also tells you that they do watch, and there's a fear/insecurity very much there. But they are also using seduction. When I say seduction, in the sense that Tibetans have a phenomenon which in English would be called half orphans, semi-orphans. So you have got parents in Tibet, but you have not met them for 20, 30 years because you came into exile as a kid, you grew up in India, then you are now in the West. So there's a possibility for you to go back to Tibet to see your parents, but you can't go back unless you sign certain things, right? So, and if you say anything against Chinese government here, then you would never get a visa. No, so all kinds of inducement, but also fear is generated to try to domesticate Tibetan movement. However, if you look at Tibetan movement in UK, in US in particular, and also India, they're politically very thriving. Of course, they have differences. There are those who believe in middle way, there are those who believe in ranks and independence, but they are still thriving. There's also growing concern about people losing the culture, but on the whole, when it comes to respect for reincarnation and respect for the Dalai Lama, it's quite strong. Now, there might be different reasons why it's strong. For older generation, it might be only religion. For younger generation, it's very much political. But for them, the Dalai Lama is a political figure also, a national leader, not only a religious leader. It comes together. But I will read out, in fact, I have it's an English translation from someone inside Tibet, Dawa Dorji in 2012. I'd come across it somewhere, right? On reincarnation. When I said that Chinese government is hoping for Tibetan Buddhists to lose trust and faith inside. So this is an example. So someone, there was a writer who's very critical of tulkus, of reincarnations. So he says CPPCC is filled with tulkus. Speeches for United Front office is filled with voices of tulkus. National religious offices is filled with minds of tulkus. The shill of tulkus is to usurp the political throne. So the argument that the poetry makes is that reincarnate lamas are essentially tools of Communist Party in Tibet to be cozy with the Communist Party, right? So that is an example where you do find parts of younger generation would start losing faith and trust in the reincarnation system. But does that make them less political? Not at all. But it does make them more modern. Well, they let them less political. In fact, it makes them more political, but there are those who do not believe that reincarnate lamas are the future. So that is what is happening in Tibet and outside Tibet. Hope that answers your question.
I've been informed that the session could go on till about 4:35. So if there are any additional questions, any follow-up questions that are there, you could please ask.
Oh, I think there's one from Jingli. So
Dian
Dian
Ching.
Jingli.
Hello, Divish.
Hi.
Hello. Long time no see. Thanks for the very great topic and discussion. Long time no hearing your speech and lecture on Tibetan issues. Regarding the politicals of reincarnation, I have two concerns related to the issue. First, it is about the religious roots of Tibetan Buddhism within the Tibetan community, especially within the Chinese borders. I think it is potentially fitting, as you mentioned, with the rise of the younger generation. And in the recent 2 years, I did 8 months field work in different areas in Tibetan regions. That could be a very serious issue. because the reincarnation, the politicus of Tibetan Buddhist reincarnation is completely rooted in a religion itself. If the religion is shaken, so the situation could be very challenging. And second point is also about the great social changes. That is, normally people think the ordinary Chinese people, I mean, they are not practice any religion. But in recent years, it is crazy. And the younger generation are worshipping in almost different kinds of, to pay a lot of money to fortune tellers. And there are even a lot of shops, I mean the real shops about fortune tellers in big supermarkets and the shopping malls. That is quite surprising. And which is also connected with the reincarnated lamas in Tibetan regions. And there are some fake lamas. So to incarnate it or not, it is not only about politicus and religion, but directly linked with money, the cash. So this could be the real challenges. I mean, for the both Tibetan Buddhism followers and other fake Tibetan Buddhist believers in general.
Thank you. It's a very important point, in fact, because what you raised is that let's say the challenge to the tradition of Tibetan reincarnation doesn't only come from politics, doesn't only come from geopolitics and contestation. It also comes from commercialization. You're right. So you're right. So of course there's a deep religious root, but there's a strong commercialization taking place of all religions, in this case of the Lama system. And you imagine that I'm a senior Lama, right? I'm a reincarnate Lama. You don't need to, I'm not a reincarnate Lama, but imagine I'm a reincarnate Lama, right? And my followers, the lineage I have, of course, is one where, I mean, why would I, if I'm a Tibetan Lama, why would I care for Tibetan cause or Tibetan welfare if most of my followers are, let's say, ethnic Chinese or Taiwanese or Indians or Westerners or whatever, and that's where my money comes from, right? So you can see that there's always an incentive within Tibetan Buddhism now to shift away from focus on Tibetan part of Tibetan Buddhism to other parts. So that those are challenges that Tibetan Buddhism does face. So again, but all religions face it. What you talked about, fortune teller, fake lamas, etc. That's it. But that does not challenge, in this case, Communist Party's hold. Because if there's a lot of fake lamas, a lot of commercialization, a lot of confusion, a lot of ordinary young Chinese people following Tibetan lamas who are not political, that will be tolerated. So when I said that the government will tolerate parts of Tibetan Buddhism, so long as it's domesticated, that's the domesticated part. Where they will not tolerate it is, of course, those lamas, if they start questioning the government politically. But I said, we are entering into a very uncertain time for Tibetan Buddhism. But where I am quite confident is, if you look at Tibetan Buddhism change in last many centuries, it has had that many times, right? It has had that. But what we're dealing, of course, is, but they never had that media scrutiny of what is happening. So you often had two reincarnation, contestation over them. But the Dalai Lama reincarnation would be Karmapas was there, but media and even Panchana. But the Dalai Lama's situation would be one where the entire world media would be focused every single minute of what is going to happen. So that's a new challenge. Thank you anyway for the question.
Sir, there's one more question. It's from Tenzin Yonton. He says that the year 2025 is when His Holiness turns 90 years old and will provide instruction regarding his reincarnation. So what are your thoughts on that?
No, that's a fact. I mean, he has said that's what he did. He has said he's older than PRC. You have to remember that part, right? So key thing for me is, look, as a scholar, I'm not a believer, right? As a scholar, is that you respect, basic thing I would say. He has said we have to respect what he says. If he says, I will reincarnate in Tibet, then nothing should stop him from reincarnating in Tibet. If he says, I will not reincarnate in Tibet, then nothing should stop. So in a way, from us as a scholar, our role is to observe it, respect what he says, and then also see how he deals with competing. It's not, by the way, I'm sure it's not easy to be the Dalai Lama, as you can imagine, with all kinds of things here and there, right? I'll come to RSS part. So that is, So what we find with the Dalai Lama, that of course there are those who want him to reincarnate, those who want him to have a solution right now, because he's not only a leader of Tibetan Buddhism, but he's also the national leader while not being a nationalist. We have to wait and see what he says. My sense would be that he'd re-emphasize his message and re-exercise sovereignty over the process, right? So absolute control. One question from Tarun is about RSS propping up. You mean Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, right? Well, the reality is, look, I broadly identify as a progressive left. That's how I identify myself, right? My question is, why is Communist Party not there in CTA? Why are left not talking about broadly, not all? Majority of left been silent on Tibet for so long. For me, therefore, the challenge is not why is, in this case, RSS getting involved, is why are non-Hindutva, non-right-wing not getting involved in Tibet, given that Tibet issue is primarily a human rights issue, at least. It's a freedom issue. And if one is genuinely left and progressive, then you have to be in favor of human rights. You have to be in favor of freedom. And you have to be in favor of those who are weak against the powerful. You can't have a better example of weak against the powerful the way you have vis-a-vis Tibetans and Uyghurs also, by the way, vis-a-vis China. And yet in Indian context, we know the left has been largely silent, if not completely on side of China. So that's the challenge. Regarding problem with our CTA, government in exile, they are ultimately refugees. You have to remember that. They don't have that much authority. So whoever from India will engage with them, they have to engage, they will engage. And I would, even though I'm personally, if anyone knows my work, I'm personally, my whole work is against Hindutva, I would still acknowledge and accept why CTA has to engage with them. Sharing anything final?
Yeah. So I think if there are no more questions, then we can wrap up.
Yeah, I'll just say a final word from my side,
Okay,
and then
yes,
you can
please.
wrap up. So I'll just say, yeah, final word from me, of course, is I just want to thank you all for having this. This is what we need. Again, you not agree with me all the time, doesn't matter. It's about, that's the whole purpose of academic scholarly discourses. Let's disagree. Let's talk about it. Let's not name each other as something, and let's carry on conversation. On Tibet matters, including India, that's what we require because it's important for Tibetans. It's important for Indians. It's important for Chinese. It's important for the world, because we are dealing with a situation which is not typically geopolitics, but we know that has geopolitical significance. So I did want to thank ICS for hosting me here, and I'm sure if I come over there, we will see that. Yeah, I know Dalai Lama being very progressive. That's what, because I'm very progressive, and I'm very progressive. I'm queer, I'm progressive, I'm very whatever. I don't use the word left in certain context of there. And for me, if you ask me who's my inspiration, it's the Dalai Lama. Because the ultimate focus is do not dehumanize anyone else. That's a lesson I get from him, by the way. Do not dehumanize even your so-called enemy. He doesn't use the language enemy. For me, that's what inspires me. So I just wanted to thank ICS for giving the option. Giving me the opportunity, and everyone who organized it. Thank you so much. Sharing, over to you.
I'll just
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
strongly echo what Dibesh you just said, that we at the ICS really believe that there should be platforms for discourse without fear or favor, and that this discourse should actually lead us to possibilities. What we are coming up against is increasingly a constriction, a restriction of possibilities, and only one or two ways which are seen as the right way. So, yes, the ICS will continue to constitute that platform for free and objective discussions. And I thank you for giving this talk today. Sharing, over to you.
I think after that enlightening and very insightful set of comments, I would not have much to add, really. It was a very, very enlightening discussion, and thank you to Dibesh for taking on all the questions very positively, and also for his open-mindedness. I mean, to also to look beyond what he was, to look at the Tibet issue and the Chinese approach to the whole reincarnation and the possibilities that can exist beyond. So I'm grateful to him, and I'm also grateful to all the participants, all the audience members who came up with really interesting questions. And thank you to ICS for this opportunity. I mean, I came to ICS after a very long time, so I'm really glad. And I think quite a good participation. So that's very impressive. I mean, saturation of online meetings, but yet, I think it was such an interesting discussion. Having Dibyesh on the platform, I think that really drew in everybody. So thank you, ma'am, and thank you to ICS. And nice to see you, Dibyesh, again after so long. Over to you,
Same here.
Muskan.
And last time it was you in still at ICS when I met you last time. So
Right.
and I'll thank you everyone. And let's carry on the conversation. That's how we see it. Okay. Thank
We
you.
must.
Bye.
Thank you, ma'am. With this, we would wrap up the session, and we thank Professor Dibyesh Anand and Dr. Sherin Johnson Bhutia for giving us their precious time. The video of today's discussion will be available on the ICS YouTube platform. Information related to the ICS Wednesday seminars will be available on the ICS website, or you could also subscribe to our newsletters for